I want to introduce our final guest, Aud Mason-Hyde. Aud is an activist, an actor, a poet. They're known for their roles in 52 Tuesdays and Fucking Adelaide. I just really wanted to say that, that's all. Okay. And Fucking Adelaide, both by their filmmaker parents. Aud, you're someone that I've really wanted to get to know and to meet, and so I'm thrilled to be on stage with you.
Thank you. What a high praise coming in. I hope I live up to it. All right, I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to go straight for it, and it is all written down, so bear with me. I am very proudly a trans, queer, and non-binary person. I'm an activist, a poet, a speaker, an actor, and I hope to be many more things in my life. I've been raised on unceded Aboriginal land, the lands of the Kaurna people in so-called Adelaide, right here, which is the land of the red kangaroo or Tundunya. I acknowledge the Kaurna people's continuing connection to their land and their guardianship of that land into the present day. I pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people here today. This is unceded land, stolen land. My connection to this land that I was born on, live on, and work on exists alongside that fact. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I was raised in a feminist family. From a young age, I was taught to acknowledge feminist elders, and through my discovery of my queer identity, I have learnt much about my queer elders as well. Oftentimes, these things overlap. I want to acknowledge that much of the reason I can speak about gender issues and the binary, and also my experience with it, is due to the work of people like Audre Lorde, Judith Butler, Marsha P. Johnson, and many more trans women, queer women, and gender non-conforming people. I acknowledge any other LGBT people in the room, and I invite each of you to take a moment to consider the ancestors that fought for you to be here today. As a queer non-binary person, I see the expansive potential of us as humans. Much of my life has been coloured by the experience of trying to find a grey area, to discover the expansive nature of myself. Throughout my schooling, I was told that I should be one of two things, a girl or a boy. Two things that I don't really have any connection to. I've never felt like a girl, nor felt like a boy, and yet the world around me has always told me I should be one or the other. So for most of my childhood, I found myself trying to be the best of both, or to be one or the other to appease those around me. On my very first day of school, on my first trip to a public bathroom by myself, I heard a voice say, "There's a boy in here." I was shocked, a little bit scared. I scanned the room in search of this elusive boy. I realised they meant me. This was new. I was unaware that I was presenting masculine, and it shocked me. My upbringing to that point had been one of acceptance and love. No one in my family saw my gender expression as a bad thing, and I hadn't ever come up against the idea that I was presenting unconventionally, nor that that could be perceived badly. My parents are filmmakers and artists, and so for them, queerness was never a bad thing. This has been one of the great privileges of my life. But it left me unprepared for the cruelty those conditioned within the gender binary would be prepared to inflict on those who don't conform to it, on me. This experience, my first ever trip to the bathroom by myself, and my first experience of misgendering, would set the tone for my relationship to gender, bathrooms, and queerness for my childhood. Looking back, it was tame, and yet, it is the first experience I can remember of feeling entirely other, of feeling alone and misrepresented. I didn't feel like myself. Gendered public bathrooms have consistently been a place of unrest, where my guard must be up. They're a place filled with fear and discomfort. Doctors' offices and medical institutions are very similar for me. Last year, I received a letter from my prosthodontist's office addressed to one Aud Mason-Hyde. When I got it out the letterbox, my heart soared. I paraded it around the house to my entire family. They got it right. And yet, when I arrived at my first appointment, the receptionist greeted me with the cold sound of "Miss." Not an uncommon occurrence, but it slashed my hopes of this being a medical office I could feel safe in. For trans people, this kind of event can stop us going to doctors. It can stop us going to therapists and specialists and even going to the hospital. Often it's much worse. Mistreatment, abuse, acts of violence from people we are meant to believe have higher standards of care. In the UK, Transaxual found that 57% of trans people avoided going to the doctor or put it off due to fear of stigma and mistreatment. And when accessing general healthcare services, 70% of respondents reported being impacted by transphobia. That statistic doesn't surprise me. In many public spaces, I feel trapped in my skin. People incessantly try to squeeze me into one of these two boxes they are convinced I have to fit into. They're personally affronted when they can't tell what I am. It matters to them. My genitals, my sex. What I didn't realise for most of my childhood was that I would never be able to contort myself into either of these boxes. I didn't conform to the behaviours which were considered essential for my gender or the opposite one. And constantly, I was ridiculed by others, kicked off of playgrounds because they were for boys, told I couldn't play soccer. People barred me from entering bathrooms at school or glared when I came out of the cubicle in public. I was raised by fierce feminists who assured me that a woman could be a range of different things, behave in different ways, dress however they wanted. And I was a girl, right? So really, I had nothing to worry about. When people said I was a boy, I stood up straight and I told them otherwise. But deep down, every time this happened, it eroded something inside of me. I knew my constant response of, I'm a girl, wasn't right either. I was cognizant of the fact that I was not a boy. Yet despite what I had told everyone, I knew I wasn't a girl either. Not because of the clothes I wore, or the things I enjoyed, or even who my friends were, but because all of these things indicated that I had no real connection to the gender binary. I didn't understand it, and it didn't really understand me. So what is this gender binary? I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's a social system, a construct, a belief. It is entirely created by people, and it's not universal or a part of nature. It was a concept brought to much of the world through colonisation and invasion. Before invasion, many Indigenous cultures had culturally significant roles for people who were not male or female. Two-Spirit people, Mahu people, Mushe, Hijra. There is much evidence across cultures all over the world of gender non-conforming people throughout history. The gender binary is something that has been imposed upon us by us, and historically speaking, fairly recently. So what exactly is it? What does it mean? What does it dictate? The binary is based on the belief that biological sex dictates your behaviour. To truly understand gender, we have to understand that what we know as gender is a curated set of behaviours. The binary dictates that a female-bodied person, someone who has a vagina, the dominant sex hormone of estrogen, and XX chromosomes, is a woman. And thus, the binary dictates behaviours that are acceptable for women, like being passive, nurturing, sensitive, and behaviours which are acceptable for men, like aggression, strength, bravery. In our binary myth, men are the opposite of women, biologically and in their behaviour. Binarised thinking tells us that these behaviours, either masculine or feminine, are innately and inseparably connected to biology. But really, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we don't really have anything near definitive enough to say that your sex will dictate your behaviour on such a level as this. I was taught, as most of us were, that testosterone makes a huge difference on our behaviour, but there is a lot of research that actually muddies that water. Our foundational knowledge of gendered behaviour comes from the work of Angus Bateman. In 1948, he conducted one observational study on fruit flies, of all things, in which he noted that the male flies were more promiscuous, eager to mate, while the females were passive. From this study, the academic community fostered a belief that male-bodied people were more sexually dominant, and that this was spurred by their higher levels of testosterone. Fruit flies. Silly, really. We see this myth of testosterone affecting our behaviour perpetuated throughout our society. But really, it is infinitely more complex. In 1998, Karen Christensen's study found that the behavioural correlation with testosterone can actually work in the opposite direction entirely. Instead of testosterone levels influencing our behaviour can change our testosterone levels. So essentially, our societal understanding of how our bodies dictate our behaviour, which is the key principle behind the gender binary, is false at worst and at least incredibly simplified. Yet, the binary is so ingrained in our customs, our language, our thoughts, that socially we are unable to separate our behaviours from our gender. We are conditioned from birth to behave in a way that is acceptable for our determined gender. I know a lot of people say, but my little girl just naturally loved pink, or my little boy loved fire trucks before he could even talk. But we have to consider just how much of that we are enforcing on our kids, even when they're babies. Really, what people are responding to when shown a baby in pink or blue is their sex. When you think about it in plain terms, it's strange. From the moment a child is born, the world around them perpetually and incessantly begins to refer to their genitalia. This results in questions of, is it a boy or a girl? Really, what we're asking is, does your baby have a penis or a vagina? Why do we feel the need to understand the genitalia of others? Pretty good question there. From a very young age, we learn how to behave through observation. From understanding that we need to eat 3 meals a day, or that we need to ask before we can pat someone's dog, to the idea that we should wear certain clothes, act a certain way, that we should be attracted to a certain gender. Even the way that we talk about LGBT rights is that of same-sex and opposite-sex attraction, same-sex marriage, same-sex families. The notion of an opposite, separate sex is intertwined with every aspect of our culture. It permeates our conversations entirely. And rarely do we question this. Rarely do we look at the idea of gender, of biological sex, and question whether it describes us accurately. There is an idea that even if the connection from gender to sex is not biologically proven, most, if not all people, will fit fairly neatly into the two sexes anyway. They either have a penis or a vagina, either a uterus or testicles, XX or XY chromosomes, facial hair or none, a deep voice or a high one. Yet, as we have seen not just in the modern day, but throughout history, this is just untrue of human beings. Humans have not, cannot, and will not ever fit into these two rigid categories, certainly not on a social level. Statistically, it is true that a lot of humans roughly fit into these categories, but statistics are too general for people. There are a large number of people who clearly don't fit into either, and these people have simply been homogenized into either category through labeling, put into one bin or the other to help us categorize. Again, this is an imposed idea, not an innate one. But it is an idea that has become our primary way of categorizing people. 2%, thereabouts, of the population is intersex, roughly 150 million people worldwide. This is the same percentage as redheads. Imagine we all decided today, collectively, that redheaded people didn't exist. You could only have brown or blonde hair. And actually, you could only have dark brown or light blonde hair. No other variations. If you had mousy brown or strawberry blonde, you must be a freak. And so, red-headed people would be classed as a light-haired, brown-haired person or a dark-haired, blonde person, even though they wouldn't really be fitting in anywhere. It's weird and restrictive and limiting. Society would be even more hostile to redhead people. This is pretty much what we've done with sex and gender. I'm aware they're not exactly identical situations, but still. In the same way that people have curly hair or straight hair, have brown, black, blonde, sandy, thick, thin hair, we have many different variations to sex too. There are people born with XXY chromosomes, those who have both testicles and breasts, facial hair, and periods. There are hairy people, less hairy people, people with heavy periods and those with light ones. And the level of hormones in our bodies vary widely across what we call the two sexes. Our bodies are varied, and none are identical. It has been incredibly restrictive to try to squeeze such variation into just 2 boxes. So if that's how strict and incorrect our notions of biological sex are, and if gender, our behaviour, is based on this deeply flawed categorization, why are we sticking to it? How many of you in this room have always, in every single moment of your life, acted exactly as was expected of you based on your gender? I don't know a single man who fits every characteristic designated to men. It is in the nature of humans to be multitudinous, to be broad and expansive and experimental and different. It's what makes us interesting and what gives us conversation. It's what I love most about people. I've never met two who are exactly the same. So, if that's the case, why are we so confronted by those who don't conform? I'm aware many of you feel like you maybe aren't confronted by people like me, but a lot of people find my existence, my appearance, confronting. People struggle to speak to me or about me comfortably. People find it hard to use my correct pronouns after years of me asking them to. I'm faced with glares, confused stares, whispers, and sometimes cruelty in many of the public spaces I enter. So just for a moment, Think about someone who doesn't conform to the binary. When you see someone and you don't know what gender they are, how does it make you feel? We are all soaked in the cultures we are raised in, and in our culture, we have the need to know what gender someone is, to know what language to use. And I would argue to know how to treat them. This gets to the heart of what is dangerous about the gender binary. The binary exists to treat the genders differently, so we can categorize, maintain, and enforce power. People who don't conform to gender appear threatening because we are. We threaten the harmful and archaic gender binary. Trans people represent freedom, liberation from rules that bind us to less free ways of life. I came out as non-binary when I was 10 years old, but the feeling of gender being unnatural started a long time before that. Before I even knew who I was or what kind of label to place on myself, I was ridiculed, excluded, or made to feel intrinsically different in places where I should have felt safe. The significance of my experiences through childhood with bathrooms, public spaces, and my gender presentation was that I came to have a deep understanding of how the world saw me, how I presented, and how I felt when I was perceived in such a way. I knew how I appeared. I was a little girl in suits to my family and a sensitive little gentleman to strangers. Never something in between. The significance of this was that I realized I wanted to be something else, something other. And the fact that people didn't see this was upsetting to me. It was through this that I knew I wanted to exist in a grey space. I wanted to be androgynous. I wasn't the black or the white, I was the grey. However, gender as we know it, as a construct, doesn't work for people like me. But I don't think it works for any of us. Gender is simply a list of acceptable behaviours we have collectively linked to biological sex. Without the notion of binary gender, there isn't a need to categorise people based on biological sex or behaviour. I'd like to acknowledge that I've had an incredibly privileged experience as a white, non-disabled, middle-class queer person living in Australia. Imagine just for a moment how the binary compounded with white supremacy or poverty or disability or anti-fat bias could work against someone. I am among the most privileged of trans non-binary people in the world, and still I have been the subject of transphobia. The world at large, perhaps in contrast to those of you in the room, cannot accept the sense of threat in non-binary and trans individuals. The gender binary is an incredibly dangerous system to live in for many trans people who don't look like me. Transgender Australians aged 14 to 25 are 15 times more likely to have attempted suicide. The last 3 years have been the deadliest on record for trans people. The gender binary and the misconceptions which fuel it are a detriment to human life. So if so many people can be harmed in such huge and impactful ways by a system which is not even accurate, why are we upholding it? I realise that's all well and good to say, but abolishing gender will be incredibly difficult. Perhaps it's not the goal we should strive for. Human beings are expansive and varied. We can exist with thousands of variations. I'm not advocating for a genderless world. I think gender is a beautiful thing. But to be clear, gender should not be binary. I'm advocating for the revolution of gender. What is it at its core? For the women in the room, what is it that makes you a woman? What is your connection to that word? For those of you who are non-binary or gender fluid, what connects you to gender? For the men, what makes you a man? Why are you connected to gender? For me, my gender can range. Gender without the binary consists of 3 things: presentation, language, and feeling. And these things don't have to be connected. A woman doesn't have to use she, her pronouns or wear feminine clothing to be a woman. For example, my presentation is generally skewed masculine, androgynous, as I'm sure you can see. The language I use to describe myself is that I'm non-binary and trans. I use singular they, them, theirs pronouns. It is integral to my well-being that I'm gendered correctly. People using my correct pronouns or not is a factor that can make a significant difference in the outcome of my day, my week, sometimes my month. I realise that can be difficult, right? It's difficult to adjust language for a lot of reasons, particularly language that's as culturally connected as gender. I use they, them pronouns. This is something a lot of people have a lot of trouble with. But I urge you to think about it not as how hard it is for you, but what the value of that is. Do you value me and my emotional well-being enough to learn to use they, them pronouns? I hope so. If trans young people are overwhelmingly more likely to try to commit suicide, will you learn how to use pronouns in a way that helps them and affirms them, makes them feel seen? Is that enough for you to do the work? Maybe you don't ever have to consider your gender in the way that I just asked you to, but we as trans people have to face our gender and how society perceives it every day. Just think for a moment about these things for you. How do you present to the world in terms of gender? What language do you use for yourself? And how do you feel about or see your gender on the inside? And if it's something you don't feel you've ever had to consider, can you see what privilege that affords you? The thing is, this will look different for most of you. The words you use will be different. The way you see yourself will be different. Gender, without the notion of the binary, or of these three things being connected, is huge and formless and has a place for all of us. I'm going to talk about being in medical situations because I think that's, why you're all here. For me, going to the doctor is really uncomfortable. In the best of these situations, with the best of doctors, the most I can expect to feel is that the doctor respects who I am, not as who I am, but as my preferred identity. Often this is addressed, however, there's been no occasion in which I wasn't misgendered, asked an excessive number of questions, and left the office with a referral or note directed to Ms. Aud Mason-Hyde, a far cry from my name and title. Yet this is the best case scenario. Recently, the worst case has meant no disclosure of where physicians will touch me before they do, no acceptance of my pronouns or identity as valid and inseparable from the person in front of them. Days in which I go to the doctor are overwhelmingly negative and filled with dysphoria. This is not normal. I shouldn't have to feel like this when going to see medical professionals. How can I open up about anything I'm experiencing if they can't even respect me enough to use the correct words to address me? Working in the trans advocacy space, a large number of organisations inevitably turn to the issue of access to gender-affirming healthcare. In the mainstream conversation, these three words boil down to three things: puberty blockers, hormones, and a limited range of surgeries. This is vital work. It's necessary to end the epidemic of suicide faced by young trans people in Australia. For me, however, the term gender-affirming healthcare means more than improving access to just these three things. Healthcare, to be truly affirming, needs to be founded in respect and understanding. We are living in a time in which trans people's right to agency and autonomy are constantly brought into question, in public forums, parliament, and in mainstream media. But the problem is not whether trans people should be able to choose what happens to our bodies. The problem is not trans kids being turned trans. The problem is a gaping chasm between the capacity, infrastructure, and understanding of our medical system and the people who need care the most. The problem is wait lists 19 years long. The problem is a lack of holistic care for young patients and a misunderstanding of how mental, physical, and gender-affirming care are connected. You know this. You live this every day. For a trans kid coming into the doctor, though, or the hospital, your workplace, their anxiety, apprehension, and discomfort exists regardless of these challenges and the complex context. The truth is that transgender identities are valid, not just medically, but socially. In every country in the world, there have always been trans and gender diverse people. So it doesn't make sense to debate our existence. And more than that, it's isolating. My life as a young trans person was one of alienation. There were several instances in which people who were meant to be role models constantly othered me, making me feel separate from them and slightly less human. No one should be made to feel inhuman. From there, it's a slippery slope to what we see happening in the US at the moment, which many human rights and legal groups are referring to as the beginnings of a genocide of trans people. This is unacceptable. But we know that we can do something about it. A study by the Trevor Project showed that just having one supportive adult in their lives can lower LGBT kids' chances of attempting suicide by 40%. That is a drastic difference, a difference that each and every one of you can have on the lives of queer children. So what is stopping you from being that one adult? I can conceptualize a future in which our advocacy as a community pays off and there is easy access to gender-affirming procedures, and yet, even within that world, I may still be misgendered at the doctor's office. Doctors will roll their eyes at their patients, belittle us in their offices, make comments about our assumed hardship, or mistreat trans patients in a number of ways. We can all do better than this. We each have the power to imagine and create a world in which we accept and love everyone, not just those we deem relatively acceptable or palatable. We should be able to love people not despite queerness or despite difference, but because of it. We should be able to think expansively. We should accept the threat to the binary and embrace the freedom that this allows each and every one of us.
Woo, take that. Thank you, Aud. Thank you to all of our speakers. You know what? I love it that I've been able to be up on stage with these revolutionaries, because that's what they're all saying to us, that we can actually create a better world, right? And we can do something differently. And I thank you all for your generosity in putting out these challenges to this audience.